Beyond its three spires, the Ladies of the Vale, Lichfield in Staffordshire is one of England's least known medieval cathedrals. It's unusual that it's 100% Gothic, with none of the original Norman church, begun around 1080, surviving above ground. What we have today is a complex building, mostly created in a series of campaigns between the 1190s and the 1360s. Of course, I'm here to point out all the bits that went a bit wrong. Firstly, you need to know whether something that looks a bit weird is a mistake at all. For instance, round the corner, at the bottom of the Lady Chapel's apse, right at the east end, is this wandering string course. Is this a mistake? No. Medieval masons were very pedantic. This is just how they reacted to the slope in the ground that the cathedral is built on. It made total sense to them. Let's go to the earliest part of the cathedral and see what we can find there. At the west end of each choir arcade, by the tower, there's this weird shaft that rises from the ground and then goes nowhere. Is this a mistake? Lichfield is fortunate to have part of its cathedral surviving as it was built in the early Gothic style. In the late 12th century, English masons were finally giving way to French Gothic ideas such as pointed arches, and there was a lot of working things out on the fly, like these shafted window arches, which are a very curious shape that presumably they thought might catch on, but you have to try these things, don't you? Like Canterbury, there's a few Romanesque hangovers here and there, like this chevron ornament on the north transept arch, and these trumpet scallop capitals. But all the arches are properly pointed, with rich mouldings that look forward to what will become early English Gothic. 3 bays of the original 1190s choir arcade survive. The rest were destroyed in the 14th century extension that we'll talk about later, except that it's only the arches and columns that are 1190s. Everything above them was replaced by the 14th century superstructure. The early Gothic presbytery at Wells Cathedral, built in the 1170s, had a similar thing happen to it, new modern windows oversailing these old arcade arches. Now, how Lichfield differed from Wells when it was built in the late 12th century is that it seemed to have vault responds lower down the elevation, very much in the French manner. Now, these needed to be removed in the modernisation process. Most of them were covered up with these statue niches, now heavily Victorianised, but not by the tower, where there wasn't room to cover it up with a statue, so it just seems to disappear behind the 14th century hood mould. So this, while it looks weird, is not a mistake. It's a leftover from an earlier building. Next, we're in the transepts, under the crossing tower. This is the south transept, heavily renovated, with big windows and a new vault in the 15th century, but essentially it's early 13th century. The north transept is even more gone over. The Victorians took out the pert window and gave it these lancers, but they didn't get rid of the clanger right up in the northwest corner of the tower. Right up there in the corner, in the clerestory. Can you see it, readers? Yeah, it's not right. Wait, just to check. Did they do it on the other side? No. Right then, it's a mistake. Now, this sort of mistake often happens in Gothic buildings around crossings, so if you miscalculate the transepts by even a smidge when you're laying them out, you'll often get squished up against the bit you're joining up with. It's similar to this mistake at Canterbury that you may remember. It's in the north-east transept, where obviously someone thought they'd have more space for that arch. Oh, go on, let's do it again. The nave is one of the masterpieces of English Gothic that no one talks about. Built in the 1260s, it has a genius mastery in combining forms, and possibly the most successful use of the spherical triangle, the way it's used to fill the whole of the clerestory. It's something which Westminster Abbey had used in the gallery. I think we can all agree Lichfield wore it better. The other thing in its wardrobe that it pulls off like nobody's business is dogtooth ornament. The nave is a riot of it, which may have been a cunning ruse by the masons to give themselves job security for the years it must have taken to carve all this. Brilliant though it is, one of the main flaws of Lichfield's nave is its structural stability. Though it's difficult to see unless you go up the tower yourself, the lateral walls quite clearly bow out from the weight of the vault and the roof, because it only had these rather flimsy flying buttresses stuck on the side. If it wasn't for James Destroyer Wyatt, who in the late 18th century removed 5 of the stone high vaults in the nave and replaced them with plaster, the weight of it would have surely caused the nave to eventually collapse. Now there is one actual dodgy bit in the design of the nave. This is when the interior elevation reaches the wider, thicker wall under what would become the west front towers. It seems that the master mason didn't bother to come up with a different design that took this into account, so the builders just slapped the normal one over it. Yeah, that doesn't look right at all. Do remember to check on the other side. Oh wow, it's even worse. Definitely a mistake. Lichfield's west front is perhaps one of the finest examples from a country that never really got the hang of the Gothic facade. As was common in 13th century England, instead of concentrating sculpture around the doors, like in France, it spread out all over the face of the building. Now it must be said that nearly all of this sculpture is Victorian, and it's possible that the medieval scheme was never even finished. Although a few beautiful original medieval statues do survive here and there, as well as this monumental Christ showing his wounds, which survives hidden away in the vestry of nearby Swinnerton Church, but was surely once on the gable here at Lichfield Cathedral. Yeah, probably a bit like that. Now, the mistake on the west front is most perplexing. Now, it's not really the west front itself, but the towers that perch on top of it. The north tower is noticeably shorter than the south. The south tower was clearly the earlier one, because the sculpture is much higher quality. Notice the tracery on the south, squashed up on the north. The lucarnes on the south, same but squashed up on the north. And this bit of trefoiling at the bottom, on the spires, is missed out on the north. In fact, the weird thing about the north is it's shorter not because there's something missing, but because everything's all a bit squashed up. How did this happen? Oh. Yes, it does seem stupid, but it seems that the cathedral lost the original masons' drawings after they finished the south tower, and when they finally got another team to build the north tower, that team copied what they could see, but they must have done it from an angle so as to slightly foreshorten it, and it ended up shorter. I really don't see how else it happened, but that's the Middle Ages for you. The Lady Chapel was begun probably in the early 1320s, certainly reminiscent, if not even directly derived, from the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. It's a soaring space. Now you might think, what happened to that left bit of the window? Well, that's not really a mistake, it's because the stair turret for the roof access is there. It's not really a mistake as such, I mean they could have put it somewhere else, but there you go. But why is only half of this window rarer arch decorated? What happened there? Ah, well, what you need to understand here is the complicated way that the East End was extended. So that they didn't disrupt the life and working of the cathedral and its canons, the 1190s presbytery that we were looking at the beginning would have been left standing in its totality while they built the Lady Chapel. The Lady Chapel would have stood on its own, probably with a temporary wooden facade or something, until in 1337 they began making an extension to link it up with the rest of the cathedral. Eventually they would have demolished the east chapel's ambulatory and high wall of the old early Gothic choir and carried the modern superstructure of the clerestory over those 1190s columns at the west end. It seems like a faff, really, but cathedrals were willing to do this so that the daily prayer of the canons was never interrupted. So yes, you can see on this not particularly accurate drawing that the left half of that window arch was probably built in the 1320s, and it only received the right half in the 1330s, when the quatrefoil idea was introduced by the mason William Ramsay, quatrefoils decorating window trims being one of his calling card motifs. So, not a mistake. Perhaps the greatest mistake of all is en route to the chapter house, which was built for the canons around the 1240s. Look up at the passage vaulting as you go in, and all seems in order, but look back to the door. Now, what happened here is, even though they were careful to notice that the two dados are different heights, and they adjusted the corbels accordingly so the vaults spring at the same level, they didn't notice, or they didn't care, that the old window from the old choir wasn't in the middle of the passage. By centering the boss over the point of that old window, the angle of the arches on the west side of the vault ended up steeper. You can see if I put a rule of thirds grid over it, then on the left side, the third is inside the jamb shaft, on the right, it's outside of it, and there's less space from that shaft to the corner. That's all it is. They want to keep the window. The chapter house itself, an elongated octagon, is full of tiny little mistakes. In fact, if we're going to finish Lichfield, we do need to talk about your vaulting, because pretty much none of it is straight. Now, I know it doesn't help that you were built in so many different bits, and also the English insist on putting a ridge rib down the centre of a vault so everyone can see that it's wonky. But, damn, look at it. Even the transept vaults that were put on in one go are completely bloody bog-eyed. Well, when you're talking about a Gothic masterpiece like Lichfield, all this really is splitting hairs. There's plenty more to discover at Lichfield Cathedral, so do visit today. It's free, and I know some great free parking spots too. But make sure you come off at Cannock, because you don't want to pay to go on the M6 toll.